The parking lot looked normal enough. Cracked asphalt, a few scattered cars, that institutional beige building that could have been any elementary school in America. I grabbed my messenger bag and walked toward the main entrance, trying to shake off the nervous energy that always hit me before starting somewhere new. 2 years of substitute teaching had taught me to expect the unexpected, but Roosevelt Elementary felt different the moment I stepped inside. The hallways were too quiet, too sterile, like someone had scrubbed away more than just dirt from the linoleum floors. "Mr. Chambers!" Principal Johnson appeared from around the corner, her smile warm and professional. She was exactly what I'd pictured from our phone interview. Confident, well-dressed, the kind of administrator who actually seemed to care about education. "Welcome to Roosevelt. I'm so glad we could offer you this permanent position." We shook hands and she led me down the main hallway, pointing out the usual landmarks: bathrooms, library, cafeteria. Her heels clicked against the floor in a steady rhythm that somehow made the silence feel even more pronounced. "The students should start arriving in about an hour," she said, glancing at her watch. "But first, let's get you oriented with our classroom procedures." Her office was standard administrative fare: motivational posters, neat stacks of paperwork, a coffee mug that read "World's Best Principal" in fading letters. She gestured for me to sit while she pulled a manila folder from her desk. "Now, Thomas, may I call you Thomas? I know you have plenty of teaching experience, but every school has its own culture, its own way of doing things." She opened the folder and withdrew a laminated sheet of paper, placing it carefully on the desk between us. "These are our essential classroom guidelines, non-negotiable requirements for all faculty." I leaned forward to read the typed list, expecting the usual stuff about fire drills and attendance policies. Instead, I found myself staring at 5 numbered rules that made absolutely no sense. Essential classroom guidelines. 1. If a substitute teacher arrives with a missing or obviously injured limb, immediately dismiss all students and lock yourself in the supply closet for exactly 30 minutes. 2. If you discover a student crying while staring at their reflection, call their name once. If their eyes have changed color, evacuate immediately and lock the door. Wait 30 minutes before re-entering. 3. If you observe a student floating or suspended in air, place an analog clock on the floor and have all present students stare at it for exactly 3 minutes. 4. Never make eye contact with the custodian before 3:30 p.m. 5. This rule was completely illegible, covered in dark brown stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. I read through the list twice, waiting for the punchline. When I looked up, Principal Johnson's warm expression had shifted into something much more serious. "I realize these seem unusual," she said, her voice taking on a formal tone I hadn't heard before. "But they are not suggestions, Thomas. They are survival requirements. Every teacher who has lasted more than a semester here follows these rules without question." "I'm sorry, but floating students? Missing limbs?" I tried to keep my voice level. "Is this some kind of orientation joke?" Her dark eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Do I look like I'm joking?" She didn't. The warmth that had drawn me to this job during our interview had completely disappeared, replaced by something that felt almost desperate. "Look," I said, trying to inject some rationality into the conversation. "I appreciate that every school has its quirks, but these aren't safety procedures. They're..." I gestured at the paper. "They're nonsense." "Mr. Chambers." Her voice was deadly quiet now. The previous teacher thought they were nonsense too. He lasted exactly 6 weeks before we had to let him go. Something cold settled in my stomach. Let him go? He had what you might call difficulty adjusting to our environment. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the empty playground. "I'm hoping you'll be more adaptable." A knock on the office door saved me from having to respond. A man in his 30s poked his head in, Latino, wearing a green polo shirt with nervous energy radiating from every gesture. Sorry to interrupt, he said, glancing between us. Stephen Boone, 3rd grade. Just wanted to introduce myself to the new guy. Principal Johnson's demeanor shifted back to professional warmth so quickly it gave me whiplash. Of course, Thomas, this is one of our most experienced teachers. Stephen, would you mind showing Thomas to his classroom? I'm sure you two have a lot to discuss. Stephen's smile looked forced, but he nodded. Absolutely. Come on, Thomas, let me give you the real tour. I stood, the laminated paper still in my hand. Should I? Keep it, Principal Johnson said firmly. Study it, and remember, these aren't guidelines. They're requirements. Stephen was already backing out of the office, clearly eager to leave. I followed him into the hallway, questions burning in my throat. Okay, I said once we were out of earshot. What the hell was that about? Stephen kept walking, his pace just a little too fast for casual conversation. Which part? All of it. Those rules are insane. Floating students? What kind of place is this? He stopped abruptly and turned to face me, his dark eyes darting around the empty hallway before settling on mine. Look, Thomas, I know how this seems, but you need to understand something. The people who try to fight the system here don't last long. The ones who follow the rules, he shrugged. We survive. Survive what? But he was already moving again, leading me toward a classroom at the end of the hall. This is you. Room 12. Your first group arrives at 9. 4th graders, mostly good kids. He paused at the doorway. Just follow the rules, okay? Don't try to be a hero. Don't ask too many questions. And whatever you do, don't ignore that paper. Before I could respond, he was gone, leaving me standing alone in my new classroom. The room was standard issue. Rows of small desks, a whiteboard that had seen better days, motivational posters about reading and math. Normal, completely, aggressively normal. So why did I feel like I was standing in a minefield? I set my bag down and pulled out the laminated sheet, reading through the impossible rules one more time. The 5th rule bothered me the most, not just because it was illegible, but because of those stains. They looked fresh enough to still be slightly tacky. The sound of voices in the hallway told me students were starting to arrive. I folded the paper and stuck it in my pocket, trying to shake off the growing sense that I'd made a terrible mistake taking this job. My first group filed in with the usual mix of curiosity and suspicion that kids reserve for new teachers. Most seemed normal enough, chattering about weekend plans, complaining about homework, arguing over pencils. But one girl caught my attention immediately. She was small for a 4th grader, with long dark hair and large brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving anything back. While the other kids found seats and started talking, she sat in the back corner, perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of Principal Johnson. Good morning, everyone, I said, moving to the front of the class. I'm Mr. Chambers, and I'm excited to be your new teacher. Why don't we start by going around the room and introducing ourselves? The usual parade of names and interests followed: soccer, video games, a concerning number of kids who claimed their favorite subject was lunch. When we got to the quiet girl in the corner, she looked up at me with those unsettling dark eyes and whispered, Maria. Nice to meet you, Maria. What's your favorite thing to do outside of school? She stared at me for a long moment, and I could have sworn she glanced toward the pocket where I'd hidden the rules. I like to draw, she finally said, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. What do you like to draw? Another long pause. Things I see. Something about the way she said it made my skin crawl, but I forced a smile and moved on to the next student. The morning passed without incident. We covered basic introductions, went over classroom expectations, started reviewing math concepts they'd covered last year, normal teaching stuff. But underneath it all, I kept feeling like I was missing something important. During lunch, I found myself walking the hallways, trying to get a feel for the school's rhythm. The building felt different with students in it, livelier, but also more tense. Teachers moved with purpose, but kept their eyes down. Students laughed and played, but there was something subdued about their energy, like they were all being careful not to be too loud or too obvious. I turned a corner and nearly walked into someone coming the other way. A tall man in maintenance coveralls with silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a ponytail. He had the kind of weathered face that suggested outdoor work and the most intense stare I'd ever encountered. This had to be the custodian Stephen had warned me about, the one I wasn't supposed to make eye contact with before 3:30 p.m. I looked away immediately, remembering the rule, but I could feel him watching me as I hurried past. There was something calculating about his attention, like he was measuring me for something I couldn't understand. The rest of the day crawled by. Every time I thought I was settling into a normal routine, something would remind me of those impossible rules. A substitute teacher walking past my classroom. I found myself checking her arms and legs for missing parts. Students heading to the bathroom. I caught myself listening for crying sounds. The analog clock on my wall suddenly seemed ominous instead of helpful. By the time the final bell rang and students started heading home, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for 8 hours. I was packing up my bag when I noticed Maria was still at her desk, carefully putting colored pencils back in their box. The other kids had rushed out the moment they were dismissed, but she moved with the deliberate slowness of someone who wasn't eager to leave. "Everything okay, Maria?" I asked, walking over to her desk. She looked up at me with those two serious eyes. "Mr. Chambers?" "Yes?" "You should follow the rules," she said quietly. "Bad things happen when people don't follow the rules." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the empty classroom with a chill running down my spine. I finished packing and headed toward the parking lot, but something made me glance back at the main building. Principal Johnson was standing at her office window, watching me leave. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in her posture, the way she held herself like someone waiting for bad news. I thought about Stephen's nervous warnings, about Maria's serious eyes, about the custodian's calculating stare, about rules that made no sense and a previous teacher who'd had difficulty adjusting. The laminated paper felt heavy in my pocket as I unlocked my car. I pulled it out and read through the rules one more time, paying special attention to that illegible 5th entry with its disturbing stains. Whatever was really going on at Roosevelt Elementary, I had a feeling I was about to find out whether I wanted to or not. I pulled into the Roosevelt parking lot 20 minutes early, the laminated rules practically burning a hole in my jacket pocket. All night I'd gone back and forth. Maybe I should just quit, find another job, get out while I still could. But something kept me here. Maybe it was stubborn pride, or maybe I actually believed I could help these kids, even in a place that clearly had serious problems. The building looked normal in the morning light. Just another beige elementary school with its sad playground and chain-link fence. But now, I knew better than to trust appearances. I made my way through the empty hallways toward room 12, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the silence. A few other teachers were already here, moving with that same purposeful energy I'd noticed yesterday. Stephen gave me a quick nod as he passed, but his expression was tense, like he was waiting for something bad to happen. My classroom door was open. I stopped in the hallway, my hand automatically moving to the rules in my pocket. I was sure I'd locked it yesterday. Positive. But the door stood wide open, and I could hear someone moving around inside. "Hello?" I called out, stepping through the doorway. A woman turned from where she'd been writing on my whiteboard. Tall, probably in her 40s, with pale skin that looked almost translucent and thin blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She wore a blue cardigan over a floral dress that might have been cheerful on someone else, but something about her made it look wrong. "Oh good, you're here." Her voice was bright and energetic, but there was an odd quality to it, like she was speaking just a little too fast. I'm Mrs. Davidson, your substitute for today." Substitute? I set my bag down slowly, studying her face. I didn't request a substitute. Her smile stretched wider, showing too many teeth. "Oh, these things get arranged by the office. You know how administration works." She laughed, a sharp sound that made me want to step backward. That's when I saw her arm. Her right arm hung at her side at completely the wrong angle, like it had been twisted and never properly reset. The shoulder looked dislocated, maybe broken, and the way the fabric of her cardigan draped over it suggested the damage was severe. She moved her left hand normally while writing, but the right arm just dangled. My blood went cold. The first rule flashed through my mind. If a substitute teacher arrives with a missing or obviously injured limb, immediately dismiss all students and lock yourself in the supply closet for exactly 30 minutes. But this was insane. This was a woman with an injury, not some supernatural threat. Maybe she'd been in an accident and couldn't afford to take time off work. Maybe the district was so desperate for substitutes they'd hired someone who should be in a hospital. "Are you?" I gestured toward her arm. "Do you need medical attention?" Her smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. "What do you mean?" I could hear voices in the hallway, students arriving, getting closer to my classroom. In a few minutes, they'd start filing in, and I'd have to decide whether to follow an impossible rule or treat this like the rational adult I was supposed to be. "Your arm," I said carefully. "It looks like you're hurt." She glanced down at it with casual interest, like she was noticing it for the first time. "Oh, that. Don't worry about it." Her laugh was even sharper this time. "I'm very good with children, very attentive." The way she said attentive made my skin crawl. And now I could hear my students in the hallway chattering as they approached room 12. I had maybe 30 seconds to make a choice that would either save my job or save something else entirely. Mrs. Davidson turned back to the whiteboard, her movements jerky and unnatural. She was writing something, but I couldn't make out the words from this angle. Her broken arm swayed with each motion, and I realized she wasn't favoring it at all. She wasn't moving like someone in pain. The first student appeared in the doorway. It was Maria, early as always, with that serious expression that made her look far older than 8. She took one look at the substitute and froze. "Mr. Chambers?" Her voice was barely a whisper. More students were gathering behind her now, but none of them entered the classroom. They seemed to sense something wrong, the way animals do before a storm. Mrs. Davidson turned around again, her smile impossibly wide, and I saw what she'd been writing on the board. "Let's play a game." "Come in, children," she said, and her voice had changed. Deeper now, with an odd echo that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. "Come in, and let's get started." Maria looked directly at me, her dark eyes full of knowledge I didn't want to understand. "Mr. Chambers," she whispered again. I made my choice. "Everyone out!" I shouted, moving between the substitute and my students. "Class is dismissed for now. Go to the library and wait for me there." The kids scattered immediately, no questions asked. They knew. Whatever was happening, they'd seen it before. Mrs. Davidson's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "But we haven't started yet," she said, and now her voice was definitely wrong, like multiple people speaking in unison. "The children need to learn." I backed toward the supply closet, my heart hammering against my ribs. "They'll learn later. Right now, they need to go." Her smile disappeared. "You're ruining everything." I reached the supply closet and fumbled for the handle, my hands shaking. The small space was crammed with paper supplies and cleaning materials, barely big enough for one person. But the rule said 30 minutes, so 30 minutes it would be. I slammed the door and turned the lock just as something crashed against it from the outside. Through the thin wood, I heard Mrs. Davidson's voice change completely, no longer human, no longer anything I could recognize. It was a sound like grinding metal mixed with animal screaming, and it went on and on until I pressed my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut. Then came the other sounds. Footsteps that moved too fast and in patterns that didn't make sense. Glass breaking, furniture overturning. And underneath it all, that terrible voice, no longer speaking words but making noises that seemed designed to drive people insane. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there wasn't. The sounds grew worse. I heard what might have been claws scraping against walls, followed by impacts that shook the entire building. Through the chaos, I caught fragments of that inhuman voice, still calling for the children, still wanting them to learn something I was grateful not to understand. Somewhere in the building, I heard screaming. Humans screaming this time, probably from other classrooms, but it lasted only seconds before cutting off abruptly. I counted every minute on my watch, each one stretching into forever. 28 minutes, 29. When the 30-minute mark hit exactly, the sounds stopped. Complete silence. I waited another full minute before unlocking the door and stepping out into my classroom. It looked like a tornado had hit it. Desks were overturned and scattered. Several windows were broken, and long scratch marks gouged the walls in patterns that looked almost like writing. My whiteboard was cracked down the middle, and whatever Mrs. Davidson had written was now illegible. There was no sign of her anywhere. I walked carefully to the hallway, glass crunching under my feet. Other classroom doors stood open, and I could see similar destruction in each one. But teachers were already moving around, calmly directing maintenance staff who appeared with mops and tools like they'd been waiting for this exact emergency. Mr. Chambers, Principal Johnson, materialized beside me, her voice professionally calm. "I see you followed protocol. Excellent." I stared at her. What the hell just happened here? "Routine maintenance situation," she said smoothly. "Nothing to worry about. The cleanup crew will have everything back to normal within the hour." Routine? That woman was handled according to established procedures. Johnson cut me off. "Your quick thinking probably saved lives today." A custodian walked past carrying a bag of broken glass, nodding respectfully to Johnson as if this was just another Tuesday morning. Through the broken windows, I could see Beckett directing other maintenance workers who were already replacing damaged items with practiced efficiency. "Where did she go?" I asked. "Who?" "The substitute, Mrs. Davidson." Johnson's expression didn't change. "I'm not familiar with anyone by that name. We didn't send any substitutes to your classroom today." My blood turned to ice. "Then who?" "Mr. Chambers." Stephen appeared at my elbow, his face pale but determined. "Can I speak with you privately?" Johnson nodded and walked away, already pulling out her phone to coordinate more repairs. Stephen guided me toward an empty classroom, checking the hallway before closing the door behind us. "They come randomly," he said without preamble. "Maybe once a month, sometimes more. Always with something wrong. Missing fingers, broken bones, injuries that should have killed them. And they always want the children. What are they?" He shook his head. "We don't know. We don't ask. We just follow the rules and survive until they leave. The missing limb. That's the only warning. The only reliable one. Sometimes there are other signs, but the injury is always there. Always recent, always severe." He looked directly at me. "The rule saved your life today, Thomas. And more importantly, it saved your students." I thought about Maria's terrified face, about how quickly all the kids had scattered when I told them to go. They knew. The students knew what was happening. They learn fast here. The ones who don't. He trailed off. "What happens to them?" Stephen was quiet for a long moment. "Nothing good." We walked back toward my classroom where workers were already installing new windows and rearranging desks. The scratch marks on the walls had been painted over with quick-drying primer, making them disappear like they'd never existed. I found Maria sitting in the library with the other students, all of them unnaturally quiet. When she saw me, her face showed such relief that I had to look away. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She nodded, but her small hands were still shaking. "You followed the rules." "Yeah, I did." "Good," she whispered. "The last teacher didn't follow them fast enough." Before I could ask what she meant, the bell rang and students began filing back toward the classrooms. The day would continue as if nothing had happened, as if a creature wearing a woman's face hadn't just torn apart my classroom while hunting for children. I pulled the laminated rules from my pocket and stared at them again. Yesterday they'd seemed like elaborate nonsense. Now they felt like a survival guide I didn't fully understand. But I was starting to learn that understanding wasn't the point, surviving was. And whatever was really happening at Roosevelt Elementary, I was beginning to suspect that these rules were the only thing standing between these kids and something far worse than a broken education system. Lunch couldn't come fast enough. My hands were still shaking from the morning's events, and I needed air that didn't smell like fresh paint and denial. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual chaos of 200 kids arguing over pizza squares and chocolate milk. But even that felt more normal than anything else happening in this building. I grabbed a sandwich from my bag and was heading toward the teacher's lounge when I heard it. Quiet sobbing coming from the girls' bathroom near the main hallway. I stopped outside the door, listening. The crying wasn't the usual playground injury type. It was deeper, more desperate, like someone was mourning something they'd lost forever. "Hello?" I called through the door. "Is everything okay in there?" The sobbing continued, steady and heartbroken. I pushed the door open just enough to stick my head inside. "Hey, is someone hurt?" Maria stood in front of the mirror above the sinks, tears streaming down her face in perfect silent tracks. She wasn't moving at all, not even breathing that I could see. Just standing there, staring at her reflection like it was showing her something terrible. The second rule flashed through my mind. If you discover a student crying while staring at their reflection, call their name once. If their eyes have changed color, evacuate immediately and lock the door. "Maria?" I said gently. She turned toward me and my stomach dropped to the floor. Her eyes were completely white, not cloudy like cataracts, not rolled back, just blank white where brown eyes should be. No pupils, no iris, nothing. Like someone had painted over them with primer. I backed out of the bathroom so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, my heart slamming against my ribs. The rule said evacuate and lock the door, wait 30 minutes. I fumbled with the lock mechanism, finally getting it to click into place just as something hit the door from inside. Not Maria. Maria was 8 years old and weighed maybe 60 pounds. This sounded like a grown man throwing his full weight against solid wood. Then came the voices. Multiple voices, all crying at once. Maria's high whisper mixed with what sounded like a teenage girl, an adult woman, an elderly man. All of them sobbing with that same desperate grief, their voices weaving together into something that made my skin crawl. I pulled out my phone to call for help, then stopped. Call who? Principal Johnson, who acted like morning disasters were routine maintenance? Security, who would ask what I was doing listening outside the girls' bathroom? The crying grew louder, more voices joining the chorus. Children, adults, all different ages and genders, but all expressing the same bottomless sadness. Through the door, I could hear footsteps. Too many footsteps for one small girl. A teacher walked past, glanced at me standing guard outside the bathroom, and kept walking without a word. Like this was normal. Like teachers routinely stood guard outside locked bathrooms while impossible sounds came from inside. I checked my watch and started counting. 30 minutes felt like 30 hours when you're listening to a choir of grief that shouldn't exist. At exactly the 30-minute mark, the crying stopped. I waited another full minute before unlocking the door and pushing it open. Maria sat on the tile floor near the sinks, her legs crossed and her normal brown eyes wide with confusion. She looked up at me like she'd just woken up from a deep sleep. "Mr. Chambers? What happened?" Her voice was small and scared, but completely normal. "You don't remember?" She shook her head, wiping at her face with the back of her hand. "I came to wash my hands and then... nothing. Did I fall asleep?" I helped her to her feet, checking her eyes carefully. Brown. Completely normal brown with healthy pupils that contracted when she looked toward the fluorescent lights. "Are you feeling okay now?" "I think so." She paused at the bathroom door, looking back at the mirror with a frown. "I had a strange dream, though. There were other people here, and they were all very sad about something." A chill ran down my spine. What were they sad about? "I don't know. They wouldn't tell me." She looked up at me with those serious, dark eyes. "Do you think dreams can happen when you're awake?" Before I could figure out how to answer that question, the bell rang, and Maria hurried off to rejoin her class. I stood alone in the hallway, staring at the bathroom door and trying to process what I'd just witnessed. 2 hours later, I was teaching fractions when something caught my eye through the classroom window. A kid was floating in the hallway. Not jumping, not climbing on something. Floating. Drifting past the window about 3 feet off the ground like a balloon that had slipped its string. I could see his sneakers dangling in empty air, his backpack hanging from his shoulders, his face turned toward the ceiling with a blank expression. For a second, I just stared. My brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Kids didn't float. Physics didn't work that way. But there he was, drifting slowly down the hallway like gravity had given up on him entirely. The third rule slammed into my consciousness. If you observe a student floating or suspended in air, place an analog clock on the floor and have all present students stare at it for exactly 3 minutes. I moved without thinking, grabbing the analog clock from my wall and setting it on the floor in the center of the classroom. 24 sets of eyes tracked my movement, but none of them seemed surprised. "Everyone look at the clock," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Look directly at it for 3 minutes. Don't look away, don't talk, just watch the clock." They did it, all of them, even the kids who usually couldn't sit still for 30 seconds. They stared at that clock like their lives depended on it, and maybe they did. The clock's hands started spinning. Not ticking forward normally, spinning rapidly backward like someone was rewinding time. The second hand whipped counterclockwise so fast it became a blur, while the minute and hour hands followed in jerky, unnatural movements. Several students started crying, but they kept staring at the clock. Tears ran down their faces as they watched time move in the wrong direction, but not one of them looked away. I kept my eyes on the clock too, watching my students in my peripheral vision. Some were shaking. One boy in the front row had his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. But they all followed the rule. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours, but eventually my watch alarm went off. The clock's hands snapped back to the correct time with an audible click, and everyone's shoulders sagged with relief. "Okay," I said quietly. "Back to fractions." They returned to their worksheets like nothing had happened, like they'd just sat through a normal math lesson instead of staring at a time-breaking clock while some kid floated past our window. When the dismissal bell rang, I was still trying to wrap my mind around what I'd seen. The students filed out normally, chattering about weekend plans and trading Pokemon cards. Maria was the last to leave, pausing at my desk with that too serious expression. "The clock helps," she said softly. "I don't know why, but it always helps." "Maria, how often does this happen?" She considered the question with the gravity of someone much older. "The floating? Maybe once a week. The other things happen more often." She looked toward the window where I'd seen the impossible. The kids who don't look at the clock, they start floating too. Before I could ask what happened after that, she was gone. I was packing up my classroom when Stephen appeared in my doorway, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen him. "Rough day?" he asked. "You could say that." I gestured toward the window. "I saw a kid floating in the hallway during math." He nodded like I'd told him it was raining. "That happens. You use the clock?" "Yeah." The hands went crazy. "They always do. Nobody knows why the clock thing works, but it does." He leaned against the doorframe, studying my face. "You're handling this better than most new teachers. Most new teachers see floating kids. The ones who last more than a few weeks do. Sometimes it's floating students. Sometimes it's the crying thing. Sometimes..." He trailed off. "Let's just say, the rules cover most of what you'll encounter. What happens to the students who don't follow the protocols?" Stephen was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor. "Some disappear. Others end up in the same state as whatever they were supposed to be avoiding. We had a substitute last year who refused to use the clock during a floating incident. 3 days later, maintenance found him on the roof, trying to swim through the air. Jesus. The kids learn fast. They have to. The ones who don't." He shrugged helplessly. "We try to protect them, but there's only so much we can do." I looked around my classroom, at the clock back on the wall, at the innocent-looking whiteboard, at the window where impossible things drifted past during math lessons. "Stephen, what the hell is really happening here?" He met my eyes for the first time since I'd known him. "I don't know, Thomas. I honestly don't know, but I know the rules work, and I know kids die when people don't follow them." He left me alone with that cheerful thought, and I finished packing in silence. Outside, the afternoon sun made everything look normal and safe, but I was starting to understand that appearances meant nothing at Roosevelt Elementary. I pulled out the laminated rules and read them again, paying special attention to that blood-stained 5th entry. Whatever it said, it was probably the most important one of all, and tomorrow I'd have to face another day of impossible things while pretending everything was fine. At least now I knew the rules worked. I just had to figure out what they were really protecting us from. I got to school at 7:30 in the morning, 45 minutes before the first bell. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few maintenance vehicles and Principal Johnson's silver sedan in her reserved spot. I'd barely slept after yesterday's floating kid incident, spending most of the night researching everything I could find about Roosevelt Elementary online, which turned up all the normal stuff: test scores, faculty listings, the usual district website information, but nothing that explained what I was experiencing. No news articles about strange incidents, no parent complaints on school review sites, no mentions of unusual staff turnover beyond typical administrative updates. Either I was losing my mind, or someone was very good at keeping secrets. The building felt different this early, less oppressive somehow, like whatever wrongness infected this place needed students and staff around to really get going. I used my key card to enter through the main doors, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. I was heading toward my classroom when I heard the familiar sound of the industrial floor buffer coming from the east wing, the custodian making his early morning rounds before the chaos started. I needed answers, real answers, and Beckett Montgomery struck me as someone who had them. I found him in the main hallway, methodically running the buffer over linoleum that already looked spotless. When he saw me approaching, his hand stilled on the machine and those intense dark eyes locked onto mine. "Mr. Chambers." His voice was low and gravelly, with the kind of authority that came from years of being the person who cleaned up other people's messes. "You're here early. So are you." I stopped about 6 feet away, close enough to talk, but far enough to run if Stephen's warnings proved accurate. "And I'm breaking Rule 4 by talking to you before 3:30. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his weathered features. "Rules are important around here." "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." I gestured toward the spot where I'd seen the floating kid yesterday. but I need to know what I'm really dealing with. The substitute with the broken arm, Maria's white eyes, students floating down hallways. What the hell is actually happening in this building? Beckett Montgomery studied my face for a long moment, like he was weighing something important. Finally, he shut off the floor buffer and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his chest. You really want to know? I wouldn't be here violating your rule if I didn't. He was quiet for another few seconds, glancing toward the main office to make sure we were alone. It's not supernatural if that's what you're thinking. I blinked. What? The floating kids? The crying episodes? The substitute teachers with injuries that should have killed them? None of it's paranormal. His voice dropped even lower. This school was built on contaminated ground, former military testing site from the 60s and 70s, chemical weapons research, experimental psychological warfare compounds, stuff that was supposed to stay buried forever. My stomach lurched. Chemical contamination. Leaked into the groundwater, the soil, the air circulation system. Been affecting people for 15 years, but the district's been covering it up instead of cleaning it up. Beckett's jaw tightened. Too expensive to remediate properly. Easier to just manage the symptoms and move problem cases around. I thought about Maria's blank white stare, about the desperate grief in multiple voices coming from the bathroom. The rules aren't mystical protection spells. They're safety protocols based on 15 years of documenting what happens when people have chemical-induced psychotic episodes. He gestured toward where I'd seen the floating student. That kid wasn't actually floating. He was climbing the walls during a toxic reaction, but from certain angles it looks like he's suspended in air. The analog clock thing disrupts whatever neurological process is happening during the episodes. Don't ask me why, I'm not a scientist, but it works. My mind was reeling, trying to reframe everything I'd witnessed through this new lens. And Maria's eyes turning white? Beckett's expression darkened. Specific reaction to one of the compounds makes the affected person extremely violent and unpredictable. That's why the rule says to evacuate immediately. She could have killed you without even realizing what she was doing. But she seemed confused afterward, like she didn't remember. She probably didn't. The exposure causes temporary amnesia about the episodes. Mercy, really. He looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of manual labor. I've been documenting everything since I figured out what was really happening. Trying to build a case, gather enough evidence to force them to clean this place up. What's stopping you? Threats, mostly. They made it clear that my job, my pension, my family's safety, all of it depends on me keeping quiet. His voice was bitter. I got grandkids, Mr. Chambers. Can't afford to be a hero when it might put them at risk. I thought about the laminated rules, particularly the fifth one with its illegible text and disturbing stains. The blood-stained rule, what does it really say? Beckett's face went completely rigid. You don't want to know. Yes, I do. No, you don't. He straightened up, suddenly looking every inch the intimidating figure I'd first encountered. Some information is too dangerous to carry around. That's why they destroyed the readable copies. Is it about fatal exposure incidents? He didn't answer, but the way his eyes tightened told me I'd guessed right. What happened to the teacher before me? Martinez. Good man, cared about the kids. Beckett's voice was flat now, carefully neutral. Started asking the same questions you're asking. Began demanding answers from administration, threatening to contact environmental authorities. And 3 weeks later, he was committed to a psychiatric facility. Involuntary hold for making delusional claims about chemical contamination and conspiracy cover-ups. Beckett met my eyes directly. Funny thing is, after 15 years of exposure, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between chemical-induced paranoia and legitimate concern about actual conspiracies. A chill ran down my spine. You're saying they had him institutionalized? I'm saying Martinez violated the fifth rule, and now he's been getting treatment for his psychological breakdown for 6 months. Beckett picked up the handle of his floor buffer. Amazing how quickly concerned teachers can develop mental health issues around here. I stood there processing this information, trying to figure out how to respond. The substitute teacher hadn't been some supernatural threat. She'd been a psychiatric patient, probably exposed to the same chemicals years ago. The floating kid was having a neurological episode. Maria was suffering from toxic exposure that could turn her into an unconscious weapon. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you followed the rules when it mattered. Because you saved those kids yesterday instead of trying to be a hero." He started pushing the buffer again, but slowly, like he was thinking. "And because Stephen thinks you might actually listen to warnings instead of charging ahead and getting yourself disappeared." "Stephen knows about the contamination?" "Everyone who's been here more than a year knows. They just don't talk about it." The machine hummed to life. "Smart ones follow the rules and keep their heads down. The ones who don't," he shrugged, "end up like Martinez. Or worse." Beckett looked directly at me one more time. "You seem like a decent person, Mr. Chambers. Take care of those kids, follow the protocols, and don't ask questions that might get you classified as psychologically unstable." He moved away down the hallway, leaving me standing alone with the weight of what I'd learned. The supernatural horror I'd been imagining was somehow worse when filtered through the lens of corporate negligence and institutional cover-up. These weren't mysterious forces beyond human understanding. They were the predictable result of adults choosing profit over children's safety. I walked slowly back toward my classroom, thinking about Maria's family fighting a legal battle they couldn't win, about students learning to navigate chemical-induced psychotic episodes like they were just another part of their education. And somewhere in this building was a fifth rule that contained information so dangerous they'd rather have it illegible than risk someone reading it. I pulled out the laminated sheet and stared at those brown stains again. Not mysterious supernatural markings, just blood from someone who'd probably discovered exactly what I was starting to uncover. The question was, what was I going to do about it? By 3 o'clock, I'd made my decision. I couldn't sit on this information any longer. Not after spending the day watching Maria struggle through what I now knew was chemical-induced neurological damage. Not after seeing other kids exhibit the same subtle symptoms Beckett had taught me to recognize. The slight tremors, the moments of confusion, the way some students seemed to lose track of time or forget where they were. I knocked on Principal Johnson's office door and walked in without waiting for permission. She looked up from a stack of paperwork, her professional smile already sliding into place. "Thomas, what can I do for you?" "I need to see the original fifth rule." I closed the door behind me and stayed standing. "The one that's actually legible." Her smile didn't waver, but something shifted behind her eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean. The rules you received are standard protocol for all faculty." "Cut the act, Melanie." Using her first name felt like drawing a line in the sand. "I know about the contamination. I know this isn't supernatural weirdness. It's chemical exposure from military testing that happened decades ago." She set down her pen very carefully, like it was made of glass. "Thomas, I think you might be experiencing some stress from adjusting to our environment. Perhaps you should consider—" Beckett told me everything. I pulled out my phone and held it up. And he's been documenting it all. 15 years of cover-ups, of moving affected staff around instead of getting them help, of managing symptoms instead of cleaning up the contamination. The professional mask cracked. Melanie's shoulders sagged slightly, and when she looked at me again, I saw the exhaustion that had been hiding behind her confident demeanor. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," she said quietly. "Then explain it to me." She stared at her hands for a long moment, then walked to her filing cabinet. From the bottom drawer, she pulled out a manila folder and set it on her desk. "The school board has known about the contamination since the building opened," she said, not meeting my eyes. Former chemical weapons testing site, just like Beckett told you. But cleanup would cost $40 million and force the permanent closure of the school. So they decided to just let kids get poisoned instead. They decided to manage the situation. Her voice was getting smaller. Implement safety protocols, monitor affected individuals, provide appropriate interventions when necessary. Appropriate interventions? You mean like having Martinez committed when he tried to go public? She flinched. David became unstable. He was talking about evacuating the entire building, calling the EPA, contacting news outlets. He wouldn't listen to reason. Because he was right. Because he was putting everyone at risk. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, and she immediately looked toward the closed door. If this becomes public, they'll shut down the school permanently. 200 children will lose their neighborhood school. 40 staff members will lose their jobs, and the families affected by the contamination will get nothing except lawsuits they can't afford to fight. I stared at her. You actually believe that justifies this? I believe that keeping the school open and following safety protocols saves more lives than destroying everything and walking away. She pulled a single laminated sheet from the folder. But you want to see the real fifth rule? Here it is. She slid it across the desk. The text was perfectly clear, typed in the same font as the others. If any staff member exhibits erratic behavior, speaks of conspiracy theories, or attempts to contact outside authorities regarding school operations, they must be reported immediately for mandatory psychological evaluation and removal. My mouth went dry. This is about silencing whistleblowers. This is about protecting vulnerable people from making decisions that will destroy their lives and accomplish nothing. Melanie's voice was getting desperate now. Do you think you're the first idealistic teacher who wanted to save everyone? Do you think David Martinez was the first person who thought he could expose this and somehow make it all better? Maybe if enough people try, they'll destroy you. She was leaning forward now, her professional composure completely gone. They have unlimited resources, teams of lawyers, connections throughout the state government. You're one person with no proof that would hold up in court. Beckett has evidence. Beckett has observations and documentation that could be explained a dozen different ways by expert witnesses who get paid more in a day than you make in a month. She gestured toward the folder. Maria's family tried to sue 3 years ago. The district's legal team buried them in paperwork and depositions until they ran out of money and agreed to a settlement that includes a permanent gag order. I felt something cold settling in my stomach. The families can't even talk about what happened to their kids. The ones who tried to fight got labeled as delusional, underwent court-ordered psychological evaluations, lost custody battles. Melanie's voice was barely above a whisper now. The district has perfected the art of destroying people who threaten their interests. And you're part of it. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the clean copy of the fifth rule between us. I've been experiencing symptoms for 3 years, she said finally. Memory lapses, mood swings, difficulty concentrating. Some days I can barely remember what I did the morning before. I looked at her more carefully, noticing details I'd missed before. The way she'd been gripping her pen too tightly, the slight tremor in her hands, the moments during our conversation when she'd seemed to lose her train of thought. The long-term exposure causes progressive neurological damage, she continued. But as long as I follow my protocols, manage the situation appropriately, they let me keep my job and maintain my health insurance. My daughter's in college, Thomas. I can't afford to be a hero. So you help them silence people like Martinez. I try to protect people like you from making the same mistakes. She was crying now, tears running down her cheeks while her voice stayed steady. David was a good teacher. He cared about these kids, but he thought he could fight the system and win. And now he's been getting psychiatric treatment for 6 months because he's convinced everyone around him is part of a conspiracy. Maybe because everyone around him is part of a conspiracy. Or maybe because chemical exposure can cause paranoid delusions that are indistinguishable from legitimate concerns about actual conspiracies. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. After a while, it doesn't matter which is which. I stood there staring at her, finally understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just institutional negligence. It was a systematic machine designed to destroy anyone who threatened it. Stephen knows all this? Stephen's been protecting you since your first day. The warnings, the advice to follow rules, he was trying to keep you from ending up like David. She pulled her phone from her desk drawer. But now, you violated the 5th rule by confronting me. I have to report this conversation. Melanie, don't. I don't have a choice. Her finger was hovering over the screen. If I don't report it and they find out later, I'll be the next one getting evaluated. I realized I was about to become another Martinez, another idealistic teacher who'd discovered too much and paid the price. In 15 minutes, there would be people here to take me for my own psychological evaluation, and all of Beckett's evidence would disappear along with me. I'm sorry, Thomas. I really am. She pressed the call button. I need to report a faculty member who's exhibiting signs of psychological distress and making delusional claims about school operations. I didn't wait to hear the rest of the conversation. I bolted for the door, my mind racing through possible escape routes. The main exit would be watched, but there was a service door near the kitchen that led to the back parking lot. I ran through the hallways, past confused students and staff toward the rear of the building. Behind me, I could already hear sirens approaching the school. At the service exit, I found Beckett waiting with a cardboard box in his hands. Heard the call go out on the radio, he said grimly. Figured you'd need these more than I do. He handed me the box, 15 years of documentation, photographs, medical records, environmental test results that had been covered up or buried. Everything he'd been collecting to build his case. This is evidence of criminal negligence, he said. Maybe environmental terrorism, but you'll need to get it to someone who can't be bought or intimidated. What about you? I'll be fine. I'm just the custodian who cleans up messes and keeps his mouth shut. He looked toward the approaching sirens. But you need to run, right now. I took the box and headed for my car, knowing I was about to become a fugitive from my own workplace. But maybe that was better than becoming another casualty of institutional protection. As I drove away from Roosevelt Elementary, I could see the ambulance and police cars pulling into the main parking lot. They'd be looking for a delusional teacher who needed immediate psychiatric intervention. Instead, they'd find empty classrooms and a box of missing evidence that might finally bring down 15 years of carefully maintained lies. I had no idea where I was going or who I could trust with what I'd learned, but for the first time since I'd started this job, I felt like I was doing the right thing.